So not only have you all had to record your videos, 300 takes for each one, now you have to watch them being broadcast in front of other people as well for sort of extra discomfort.
Yes,
But even that's, it's all valuable experience, I suppose. But well done. Thank you very much. It's always nice to hear everybody, playing the music. So where is Teresa? I think she's down at the bottom of my screen. Great. Are you there, Teresa? Just in case I've got the wrong person.
she,
Yes.
she is there. And the other she's on Isle of Wight.
Oh, the Isle of Wight. Excellent. That's where Mark Eden comes from.
Yes.
Gurnard, around there. We've got some quite good friends down there, Hannah and Simon King, actually, who I think Hannah runs a food bank or helps run a food bank down there, if I remember. I'm not sure if you. Anyways, I'm sure it's a. I can't just presume that everybody knows everybody else on the Isle of Wight, but isn't that supposed to be why Bognor Regis is super sunny, isn't it? Because the Isle of Wight creates a special weather
Uh,
phenomena, I think.
yeah, we certainly have superb sun today, and you as adjudicator, which often goes together.
Well, I will try and maintain my sunny demeanour. Um, So very nice. I enjoyed your playing, Teresa. It's a very gentle piece. It's a very gentle character that the whole piece should have. Very reflective, and it's that sort of slightly bittersweet nostalgia for the last few days of summer. You know, that feeling we all get when we go back maybe to work or school in September and slightly lament, these lovely days. A bit like we're having today, really, actually, where, in the middle of November, it'll be quite hard to imagine a day like this. So it kind of taps into that sort of nostalgic feel. Um, so I thought generally the feel and the flow and the character is nice. I think you could just work a little bit at trying to make your shifting a little bit more fluid. Obviously, that's quite a big feature of moving around the guitar, having confidence and maintaining rhythmic cohesiveness when you shift. So sometimes we slightly hesitate just in case we're worried, we're going to miss. Or sometimes we just make small errors of, when we land. We might kind of land in fifth position, but not quite, so it buzzes just a tiny bit. So just a couple of little places where I think the shifting could be a little bit more smooth. And some of the notes in the bass, have a look out for bass note length. They're nearly always semi-breathes or very long notes, and just try and make sure that the fingers that are sustaining those are really, really nicely held so that everything else moves around that fixed point. It's quite easy for a bass note to sort of pop off without us noticing it when we're thinking about the treble, for example. But I thought it's a very nice control in higher positions, and a lot of the shapes in the left hand were very nicely resonant. I mean, a very small feature just in terms of the way you were set up for the video was that I noticed you looked a bit like you had the music over to your right and then you were looking at your left hand. So I'll do a bit of an impression. It was a bit like this was happening. Like that. Whereas maybe if you've got the stand just to your left, see, I cheat. I have the stand to my left, just down below where my left hand is, just like when you're driving. Mirror signal maneuver, as I always say, like the old highway code. Keep the music down to your left, and then if it's sort of in the field of vision roughly where your left hand is, then you can just glance down to it and just adjust your focus accordingly. Which I appreciate sometimes. If you're anything like me, is not as easier said than done these days with close-up glasses. But generally, if you can keep the music to your left, you'll find that just a little bit easier. And sometimes I find if I'm looking, at the music in a slightly awkward position, that can be a bit disorientating. Generally, just try and aim for a slightly stronger sense of projection. You actually make a very nice sound. I think it could just have a little bit more presence. And obviously, lockdown in some ways exacerbates that tendency that we all have to play quite quietly in a room on our own. Guitarists do spend a lot of time on their own in relatively small rooms, perhaps having lessons in small rooms. And then all of a sudden, when we go back into slightly larger spaces and play, I mean, I've noticed that with some of my students, they've suddenly become, a little bit more introverted in terms of projection because they'd lost that need to have to keep projecting the sound in a bigger space. So it could just generally have a little bit more presence, even though it's marked quite softly for a lot of the piece. A couple of very small little housekeeping issues. In bar 28, when you have this little phrase that goes... This phrase here, just be careful when you shift up, this shape isn't quite right. It's not exactly the same shape as this one. It changes very slightly. There's an E on this note here, not a D. Seems a very small point, but it changes the harmony, because otherwise we have an F major chord and then a G major chord. Whereas if you have an E, you have a minor inversion, which is a very slightly different flavour. So that one note changes the harmony fundamentally. So again, sometimes wrong notes or misreadings have more significant impact on the music than others. But it's only a very small thing. And just don't forget to play the bass A in that bar as well. I'm not sure if you were playing it and it was just very, very soft, which may have been the case, and perhaps the microphone didn't quite pick it up. But generally that thumb note, the A on the 5th string, can have a little bit more presence. And just double check your detail in bar 38. You've got your right hand just got a little bit tangled in one or two places. I always have this idea that we quite often know what's going on in the thumb in the bass, and we often know what's going on in the melody at the top. But then sometimes the right hand fingering gets a bit vague with the middle parts when we're playing detail on maybe the 3rd and 2nd strings or 4th strings, and it switches around between them. So just be careful of that phrase. That one there I actually play a bit higher up. And there's lots of space at the end of phrases. That's what I call a long minim as opposed to a short minim. You know, sometimes a minim can be long and sometimes it can be a bit shorter. 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. There's a little bit of space that you can take, you know, just to breathe. But well done, I enjoyed that. So next we have Baz, who plays Joie de Vivre. I failed French O-level, so I apologise for my pronunciation. I still remember my French O-level oral, which to this day was one of the more embarrassing experiences in my life. When the examiner asked me how I was going to pay for something, I couldn't remember what traveller's checks were, so I said American Express. I think that was the moment I failed the exam, actually. I think I deserved a mark for initiative, if nothing else, but I think if there was a fail box, you know, he ticked a box just after I said that, and I just thought that's probably the fail box. I realised that was the moment when the guillotine came down and it was all over. But after my potted speech about the Eiffel Tower and having gone to Paris, after that I was floundering, you know, when it went into general conversation. So French and I have had a sort of, you know, slightly mixed relationship over the years. Anyway, enough about my O-level traumas. So anyway, Baz, I enjoyed this very much. I thought it was... which take was this?
David, can you unmute Baz?
Excellent. I'm impressed with the dedication.
So-
They have an idea.
I think it was 10. I think it was 10.
I can totally relate to that. I mean, they have this idea sometimes when you're recording professionally that you often gravitate towards one particular take over another. So if you're recording an album, quite often, normally what I do is I'll do 3 takes, and then if I still haven't got everything covered, then you sort of do patches of other sections, you know, maybe to sort of see if you can repair the damage. But you quite often find that people, not always without exception, but gravitate to one of those takes more often than the other. So some people are really fired up, you know, the first take comes along and they're there, you know, and they do it and the first take's good and then it sort of fades away. Other people are a bit jittery on the first take and then they relax into the second one and it's much better, and then they fade a bit on the third. And other people just sort of gradually relax more and more as the whole thing goes on. And the third take is the best one that sort of gradually repairs all the problems in the first 2. So you'd probably find if you kept doing this on a regular basis, you'll find yourself gravitating to... I'm not sure how it works with 10 takes, you know. So I'm an 8 take player, maybe. I'm not sure. But that's dedication for you. Well, thank you very much, because I think the efforts were worth it. It sounded very nice. I think you captured the feel of the piece very well. Good choice of tempo again. Maybe just a little bit of tonal clarity and consistency is lost in 1 or 2 places, partly because you make a nice sound generally. It's what I call being a victim of your own success. If you don't sustain that nice sound, or we lose a little bit of the definition of it, then it just becomes a bit more noticeable because we've got used to it being there. So, you know, one or two very small places where that happened. Just let me find the piece in this book. There it is. Now let's have a look. What did I write? Yeah, and I thought the texture was nicely defined. You know, generally bass, treble, and inner voices was really clear. First thing I wrote was try to sustain the bass C all the way through bars 10 and 14. So you know when you have this little passage that goes that one. So the C in the bass, this one lasts all the way through, and you just let it pop off when you got to there. Because obviously it feels difficult to hold. So it's like it's two shapes, that one and then this one. So maybe just look out for that one. That was, I mean, I'm really splitting hairs here because a lot of it was very, very good. Again, because you sustain the voicing well, sometimes when the bass wasn't sustained, then I noticed it more because, you know, I lost that presence of the bass line just a tiny bit. Enjoy the high B a little longer in bars 5 and 21. So when you have this little phrase that goes, you could maybe just savour that note just a little bit more up at the top. Start the rowl maybe a little bit earlier in bar 24, which is the bar with the harmonics. Maybe that could just, I always use the analogy of cycling, that, you know, you stop pedaling and then you start slowing down a little bit later on. So you just need to take the energy out perhaps a fraction ahead often of where the RAL is marked. So it's a bit like psychologically you maybe stop pedaling as it were at the beginning of the bar, and then the energy starts to dissipate kind of, you know, halfway through the bar, and it just has a slightly different feel. But I could sense you were doing the RAL. I think it's just sometimes an example of one of those things in performance that needs exaggeration. It needs a little bit more than you think in order to come across really, really clearly. We have a habit of filling in gaps in our own mind because we know how the piece goes. We often think things are there that haven't quite come across as vividly to a listener. Say, you know, well, I always use row H, but, you know, row A. Or on Zoom, perhaps we need to start using a new terminology. Check the repeated E in the upper line of bar 26 beat, second beat. Yes, when you have this phrase at the end, after you've done the harmonics, when it gets to here, da, 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 I think maybe either you missed it or you played a dot, I'm not sure. It just repeats. It's a very small melodic detail. And maybe just magnify your colour changes. They were slightly more visible than audible, if that makes sense. So sometimes you had a really nice natural. Sometimes when you change colour, try and change the angle of the nail very slightly as well. So there's my natural sound. Then when I go to Ponticello, and then really come right up over the fingerboard. So hopefully you hear, you know, this sound from natural, you know, very, very, very sort of distinct characters to them. But they were there. They just needed a little bit of magnification, but well played. Then Jez, from our entry from New Zealand.
Yes.
It's even later in the morning for you now, 2 o'clock. Are you still awake? I'll try and keep this.
Yeah, just about.
Now you know what it's like when I came and played in New Zealand.
Yeah.
It was like playing a concert.
You're slightly better than me, though.
I played about 7:30 in the morning, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah.
It's funny, really, because I remember. Well, certainly the concert I did in Sydney. I remember thinking that the concert was. It started in my equivalent of 7:30 in the morning, and I just remember feeling a bit better in the second half, which was the equivalent of about 8:30 in the morning. But that's just quite a good way of practicing, isn't it? You could get yourself out of bed at 4 in the morning to recreate jet lag, and then you have to try and run through your concert program. Anyway, hopefully one day I will experience jet lag again. It's not something I've had to worry about over the last 18 months or so,
Yep.
for better or worse.
Looking forward to it.
Anyway, the first thing I wrote was a positive spirited performance. So you kind of went for it. And actually, I'm not just saying this, it does sound a lot better than when I remember hearing you play it in New Zealand. So you've improved. So anyway, I put the broad energy and character were nicely suggested, and the big musical gestures, because it is a piece of gestures. It's quite quite a lot of theatre involved, and you capture the feel for the extrovert style and the general character of the piece. And I was talking to a student about this yesterday. Sometimes we have this idea of what accuracy is in a performance. Let's say you played it very, very slowly, very neatly and very rhythmically. It might be accurate in some ways, but not then have quite the right character and the right general feel. So I think you've got the intention and the feel of it really nicely. What I would say probably needs sorting a bit more is just really faster divisions and fine detail. So little things, particularly slurs, actually. It's interesting because when I heard it second time round, when Sasha was playing it, I found myself, I wasn't looking at the screen as much and I was just listening. And sometimes I couldn't hear slurs. So generally, there's quite a few places where you've got to coordinate quite difficult slurs. I mean, even just in the first line. And I was going to suggest, which we may have done anyway, so in which case, just humour me while I repeat myself, but lots of slow, incremental practice, building up motifs one at a time. That's what I call like building a Lego model. So you take each individual brick. So say I was practicing the very beginning. That's the first bit, and it goes. So I've got that. Let's say anyone was learning this piece. So the first thing I've got to do is strum the chord. Then I've got to get the E. Then I've got to do the ornament. So I've done 2 stroke 3 of the bricks. There's another brick, and then another one, and another one. So I might just do that, then add the slur. Can you see? Obviously, I'm doing it, probably a bit quicker than I would recommend, and what I find useful for that is particularly when I'm learning repertoire. If there's a passage I'm having a problem with, it's a very good diagnostic as well for finding where the nub of the issue is technically. So, I mean, you know what the piece is like. It's quite it has these little, each couple of bars is kind of like an exercise, isn't it? Even the first bar, that was sort of how I thought of it, was more of a didactic thing, playing a D major chord and practicing slurs, lifting fingers off and putting them back on again. So each little sort of fragment often has, it's a bit like an exercise in its own right. It's a bit like when we're doing that one. Sometimes you can just take that little, that little fragment, stick the metronome on, and try and rotate it round, in time, until your wife tells you to shut up. Jez, can you play something else? You've probably played it enough times. Do you have to play in the garage or in a separate cubicle or something?
Yeah, fortunately our house is quite long, so she's in the living room and I'm right at the back, so she doesn't hear me.
Excellent. So maybe if you're projecting really loud, then and she hears you, then you must know that you've played loud enough. Maybe that's your next test. You've got to make her hear it in the other end of the house.
I'd like to.
I was always quite tough when I was at the academy. I got told off once in the corridor by a piano teacher because the sound had travelled through the double doors and he could hear it out in the corridor, and he told me to shut up. I was thinking, yes, I've projected loud enough. And anyway, so lots of Lego practice. I'm just trying to think of other places. Right there. there's a couple of places where you have to pluck and slur at the same time to coordinate things. So again, that's a good example. I might just freeze at that moment. You know, it's a bit like Zoom. You suddenly freeze mid-conversation. But sometimes if I freeze at that point, saying I've landed badly, then I think, oh, maybe that's the catalyst for the problems that follow. Like dominoes knocking over one after the other. You think, oh, that's where the first one falls. And sometimes you actually realise that it's not necessarily a problem playing the subsequent notes. It's just the fact that they get disrupted by something else that happens earlier on. So it's just got, you know, little things like that. I think generally it could just have a slightly more stable pulse. I think it was better. Do you ever practice saying the pulse while you play it? It's quite tricky. So you might go 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And actually just saying the numbers. It's quite different to tapping your foot, which people often do. But when you say the numbers, you have to physically think about, you know, where each beat fits. You could even try recording yourself and try conducting the 4. You know, when you used to have to do that in exams. And sometimes you can find your own beat hard to follow. So it's like it might start off really nicely. You might be going da 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 da. You know, you might find just one or two places where you can't sense quite where that 4 is measured. And it is very strange. I often think of Einstein because I think when you're performing, time travels at a different speed to when you're in the audience. You ever notice that? It's like time dilation. So, you know, you listen back to it and you think, God, I had no idea I played it as fast as that, or I had no idea that that bit that I thought I was playing forte there and it didn't come across, or I thought I did a colour change and I didn't hear anything at all. No, it just sounded exactly the same. Sometimes just this idea of how we perceive things in the moment when we're concentrating on playing them is quite different to how they then come across when we're, you know, sitting back, as it were, relaxing in the chair, not having to physically produce the sound. Yeah, that's right. And I wrote with the metronome, and what you can try doing is, obviously the pulse is dun 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 dun. You might have a crotchet on, say, but also practice doing it with different divisions. So it could be that you do it to a minim, dun 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 dun, or quicker quavers, dun 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 dun. So you get smaller subdivisions and also bigger pulses. I mean, occasionally with certain pieces you can do, you know, the first beat of the bar. Obviously that needs a very slow metronome, probably about crotchet equals 30 or something. But occasionally you can do that, you know, and so you practice measuring between slightly different units, and it sometimes makes you slightly more aware of where you're likely to get unstable rhythmically, or where you clip longer note values, things like semi-breves that maybe become, you know, 3 3/4 instead of 4, or a crotchet that becomes, you know, 0.8 of a crotchet, not quite a crotchet. And that's often how rushing happens, is through very small incremental gains. It's a bit like the monetary equivalent of, you know, saving pennies in a jar. It might, you know, by the end of the year you might have 10 quid in there or something. But and the same thing with rushing. You might just, you know, do the equivalent of a penny's worth of rushing. You get to the end of the piece and suddenly you're, you know, 1.5 times the speed you started at the beginning. So it can creep up on you without noticing, rushing. It's a strange thing. Have you ever had that? You kind of think, how the hell did I end up this fast? I have no idea. Even though you start off at the right speed, you know. So just be aware of that. But it was great. I really enjoyed it. I think it's fine detail, but I would particularly gravitate towards anything with slurring. I think generally slurs can have a bit more control and a bit more coordination, especially when you're having to fire off right-hand things. It's a slightly annoying thing I do in my writing, hammering on and pulling off notes in the left hand while plucking. So sometimes the left hand is producing one sound and the right hand's doing the other. So and they can be a bit of a, you know, bit awkward to coordinate. And unless you get absolute synchronization, they sometimes just get a tiny bit tongue-tied, a bit like a tongue twister that doesn't quite get, you know, pronounced properly. They're the sort of technical equivalent of 6 thick thistle sticks. Did we do tongue twisters once, Sasha? I can't remember. 6 thick thistle sticks? Try saying that to yourself.
Oh, you know, at the moment it's only Tongue twisters connected with seashore.
Yes, she sells seashells on the seashore. The one I was just like was Betty Botter bought some butter, but she said this butter's bitter. If I put it in my batter, it will make my batter bitter. But a bit of better butter, better than my bitter butter, will make my batter better. Yeah, it kind of carries on after that. But it's a bit of a nightmare. But the trouble is, it's quite interesting because it's a bit like playing. Because if you start thinking about it, you can't do it at all. Once you've rehearsed it, you can't think about it. You just have to kind of trust yourself to do it. Trust your fingers. But anyway, well done. And last but not least, we have Jay. Actually, what I was going to do, I'm going to send some little links through that may or may not be interesting. I got these ready because Sasha was talking about inspiration for things. So if you can you the chat looks like it's disabled, Sasha. Can you just
David? Yeah. David, can you put the chat?
maybe you could activate that.
It's not disabled as far as I know. It's let me just
Let's have a look.
check. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh yes, there we are. That's it. It's up. It's up now. Great.
It was disabled. Sorry. Yeah.
No problem. Don't worry. It's fine. It's.
Are you going to send the links with the tongue twisters?
No, what I'll do is I'll send you some links. This very first one, I haven't listened all the way through to this, but this was the ballet. It wasn't actually the ballet at Covent Garden, but it was the ballet. It was a Chekhov ballet called Winter Dreams. And so with the juniors, and I think it was Sophia, wasn't it, who played the...
Yeah, it would be wonderful to watch what has inspired you.
that was the link. That just gives you a rough idea.
Super.
This is a funny one. Jez will probably relate to this. Do you remember Thomas Dolby, Jez? Were you a Thomas Dolby fan?
I remember the name, but that's about it.
This was a track called Spice Train, which sometimes what you notice is interesting when you compose is that things rub off via osmosis. And so you hear things, you think, oh yeah, I really like that sound, and then things crop up in it, and you'll definitely notice some similarities with this and my piece. That's very much from a stylistically different sound world. Then you've got the rodeo from Copeland, of course, which Jez has just played, Rondo Rodeo, which is very like that. I was kind of, the original idea for Rondo Rodeo came from the Copeland piece. And then the reason I thought I would do it now is I'm going to put some pictures up, or links to pictures. So this picture is particularly relevant to Birds Flew Over the Spire. This is from the Tate. And there's another one just coming. I thought you might find these interesting to look at while I was talking about the piece.
Will I have those links in my email, David?
No, you should have them on the chat. If you go to the chat of Zoom.
Oh, I see. So they will be there.
Yeah. If for any reason they've not come through, I'll send them in a little message to you at the end and copy them through as well. So
thank you.
Anybody's interested, but
yeah,
they're all there in people's chat.
Send them together with your comments if you could say that. That's good. Wonderful. Yeah. So
there's a couple of pictures at the end there, for example, Jay, there's some pictures by an artist called John Wells, whose sort of paintings I really liked when I went down to Cornwall. He's one of these people who lived down at St Ives, and how the artist really liked the light and the sort of general feel for working down there. And he was interested in the way bird flights formed, arcs and shapes in the sky. So I think it's the first one of those is a bird. Actually, funny enough, I've got this picture up on my wall. The bird is made up of bird flights. So it looks a bit like a sort of, I don't know what it is, like a pelican or something, doesn't it?
Yeah, it looks great.
But it's made up of the flights that he recorded of birds, flying around over the cliffs of St Ives in Cornwall and things like that. And Aspiring Forms was a very similar one that makes it look like a ship, but like a ship's sail and the way the. So, I mean, I wasn't writing specifically to make the piece like this, but I liked the idea of thermals and the way things sort of glide and float, you know, almost like for free. It's like birds kind of get a free ride just by going and gliding up on the thermal. So the idea in the left hand was the way you kind of moved around in the left hand was not dissimilar to that sort of energy you see when a bird will just kind of enhance it will capture the thermal and ride it, you know, together with a little bit of wing motion, but it's sort of enhancing what's naturally there. So that was sort of part of the idea. I thought you might just find it quite interesting to have a look at. But well played. I really enjoyed your playing, actually. I thought it was very confident, good rhythmic flexibility, and a nice feel for the relaxed, spacious style. Maybe just a fraction fast. I think you can just, you know, I mean, we're talking, if you measured it in metronomic beats, which is not quite appropriate, it would be 1 or 2. I mean, it's not fundamentally fast, but it just perhaps needs a tiny bit more zen, if that's the right word. You know, just a little bit more meditative, or draw out slightly more of the dreamier meditative qualities. Good mobility around the fingerboard. Notes, there's 1 or 2 places where notes can ring over each other just a little bit more. And I wrote here, it's not always easy to convey this in guitar notation without making it look over complex. So it's a hard feature of guitar music because it's all compressed down onto one stave. If you try and cram too much voicing and too much information into it, it just ends up looking incredibly cluttered. So I'm always acutely aware of trying to make things appear visually as simple as I possibly can. But sometimes you have to convey voicing so it's clear when notes should be held or sustained, or whether they should be detached. So, I mean, a good example is just at the beginning. You know, there's nothing even to say that these notes should ring, but intuitively they do ring, and you quite rightly let them ring because that's how they should sound. But it could be interpreted as, which of course kind of would be wrong. So that's supposed to ring. And all these were really nice. When you get to this one, some of the stepwise motion could also ring. Can you see like that? Like that. Some of the ideas obviously came from, you know, Brower, because there's that lovely place up here where you get that really nice sound. You know, so the bird kind of glides up to, you know, 7th, 4th, and then sort of floats back down to 1st position. So you could kind of see the analogy, you know, maybe with some of those nice arcs or curves. And it's got a nice way of thinking of the left hand in terms of the way it moves, you know, to think of it in a slightly more with a sense of curvature, because the guitar fingerboard obviously is like a grid. So it kind of, in a way, it looks square, and that perhaps camouflages the fact that a lot of what we're doing is curved. I don't know if that remotely makes sense, but I'm sure you get the idea of what I mean. You know, so very much, you know, sometimes it's quite interesting to think if you were, I often see the fingerboard kind of in the air. If I was going da, 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 it's almost like it might have a figure of 8 in it somewhere. When you get to the D sharp, you might kind of turn around. It's an interesting idea how you might arc it. You know, when you're doing sparklers on bonfire night, it's got something of that, and you see the line and the light after you've waved it around. It's a little bit like that sort of idea in the left hand. Yeah, so I put, in piano terms, this would equate with slightly greater use of the sustain pedal, for example. So it's just to do with that. You could possibly just aim for a slightly more generous, rich thumb tone occasionally in a few places as well. Just give your bass a little bit more weight, like when it goes just a few places where the melody sort of drops down into the bass and you get a little bit more, you know, an inversion of the melody and accompaniment. And enjoy that high B, you know, when it goes that one. So again, it's like it kind of arcs up to the top. You know, there's that point when they sometimes just sort of float in the air and it almost looks like they're just not moving at all because the wind's keeping them in the same position. And it's almost like that, and then it kind of falls down. So it's very much something of that, you know, interesting idea about notes being suspended in the air and the kind of forces that hold them there, if you like. This is quite a philosophical adjudication, but anyway. But I mean, obviously, it's only. I've always been quite interested in concision. I like things like haiku, Japanese haiku, and trying to say quite profound things in small spaces of time. So in some ways, I was sort of tapping into that a little bit, because it didn't take a hugely long time to write, but I was trying to get quite an interesting concept into that, just into that small space. But anyway, thank you very much. I hope that was of some use to everybody. So I had to pick a winner. Good grief, this is a tricky one. I think on my form here I've put that I think of the 4 performers, Jay Huff got very close to Birds Flew Over the Spire, and I'd like to commend everybody, but Baz was a runner-up by a whisker.